March 13th, 2019, late evening in Athens, Georgia. The Athens-Clarke County Police Department receives a 911 call about a home break-in where someone has shattered a window and stolen cryptocurrency worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The caller is James "Jimmy" Zhong, a 28-year-old living in the Athens area, and what he doesn't tell the dispatcher is that he's secretly sitting on one of the largest caches of stolen Bitcoin in history, billions of dollars hidden in his home. For the dispatcher taking the call, this is just another shift in a college town known more for University of Georgia football than financial crimes. Someone broke through a window, grabbed crypto, nothing unusual for 2019. She logs the incident, marks it routine, moves on to the next call. What she doesn't know is that this routine burglary report would later become the thread that unraveled a $3.36 billion mystery that had haunted investigators for nearly a decade. The responding officers treated it as standard property crime, taking statements and documenting the broken window and the missing electronics, completely unaware they were standing in a home containing roughly $3.36 billion in stolen Bitcoin hidden throughout the house. But here's where the story reveals its first layer of irony that would define everything to come. Jimmy wasn't just a victim calling for help. He was a thief reporting being robbed by another thief, and neither of them knew that this police report would eventually trigger a federal investigation that would seize everything. Criminals frequently interact with police as victims or witnesses, creating paper trails they don't anticipate in moments of vulnerability or need. In Jimmy's case, that burglary report would sit in an Athens filing cabinet for months, waiting patiently the way digital evidence always waits. In the analog world, secrets rot, but in the blockchain world, they persist until someone finally looks. Prosecutors would later connect Zhong to approximately 50,000 Bitcoin stolen from the Silk Road dark web marketplace back in September 2012. But on this March evening in 2019, nobody had made that connection yet. The police report doesn't identify who the burglar was or how they knew what to look for, and that aspect remains unresolved to this day. Someone out there broke into what turned out to be a secret billionaire's house, but their identity and motives remain unknown. A shattered window, a routine call, and the first crack in a billion-dollar secret that had been perfectly preserved for nearly 7 years. The invisible billionaire had just made himself visible.
To understand how James Zhong ended up connected to billions of dollars in seized Bitcoin, we need to go back to the beginning. James "Jimmy" Zhong was born on May 24, 1990, and came from a difficult family background with a childhood marked by isolation and challenges. Defense filings described how he had no friends or family he could turn to, finding solace in the world of his computer, which became not just an escape, but the only place where the rules made sense and interactions followed predictable patterns. In 2009, when Jimmy was just 19 years old, Bitcoin emerged, created by the mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto as the world's first decentralized digital currency, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system that operated without banks or governments or any central authority. The Bitcoin community during those earliest years was tiny and idealistic, with users on Bitcoin talk forums debating monetary theory under pseudonyms and sharing mining tips and dreaming of a financial revolution. It wasn't just about the technology for many early adopters. The community attracted people who were technically skilled and anti-establishment and often socially isolated, finding in Bitcoin not just a technology, but a belonging and an identity, and a place where intelligence mattered more than social skills. Jimmy was fascinated, diving deep into the Bitcoin community and joining forums and reading white papers and connecting with other early adopters who valued him for his technical understanding rather than judging him for his social struggles. For someone who struggled with social interactions, the anonymous online world of cryptocurrency was incredibly appealing, offering a space where he could be valued for his skills without anyone caring about eye contact or social cues, or any of the invisible rules that governed normal human connection. In a world where people ignored him, Bitcoin was a system that listened and responded and made sense in ways that human beings never did. By 2012, when Jimmy was 22 years old, Bitcoin had grown from a curiosity into a phenomenon. He was a computer science student in Georgia who struggled with social challenges, including an autism spectrum disorder, seeking acceptance and connection in ways that would eventually lead him down a path he couldn't come back from, looking for validation in systems and numbers rather than in the messy complexity of human relationships. One September day in 2012, Jimmy accessed a dark web marketplace called Silk Road. Maybe out of curiosity, or maybe looking for something to buy, or maybe just exploring the way technically skilled young people explore systems to understand how they work and where the boundaries are. What he discovered there would make him a billionaire by 30 and a federal prisoner by 32.
Silk Road was unlike anything the internet had seen before. Launched in February 2011 by Ross Ulbricht, a libertarian idealist operating under the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts. It was a digital black market accessible only through the Tor network, a special encrypted system designed to conceal users' identities and locations. Ross saw himself as creating a new kind of freedom, wanting to use economic theory as a means to abolish the use of coercion and aggression amongst mankind, positioning himself as a revolutionary building something that would outlast governments. Ross wasn't a typical criminal. He held a master's degree in material science and practiced yoga and kept detailed journals about his moral philosophy, where he wrestled with the contradiction of his marketplace facilitating harm while claiming to promote freedom. The marketplace itself was revolutionary in its simplicity, allowing buyers and sellers to trade illegal goods and services with near total anonymity, and all transactions were conducted in Bitcoin, which added another layer of anonymity. By September 2012, Silk Road had become the largest darknet marketplace in the world, with nearly 13,000 listings facilitating millions of dollars in transactions every month. But to Jimmy, Silk Road was something simpler than a political statement. It was a place with a vulnerability, a flaw in the code that someone with his technical skills might be able to exploit. On September 19, 2012, Zhong accessed Silk Road using one of his accounts and deposited 500 Bitcoin into his vendor wallet. At the time, Bitcoin was trading at around $12 per coin, so his 500 BTC was worth approximately $6,000. What happened next would become the subject of federal prosecution years later. Zhong discovered a vulnerability in Silk Road's withdrawal processing system, specifically a timing or race condition issue that allowed multiple withdrawals to be processed before account balances could update properly, creating a window of opportunity that lasted only milliseconds but could be exploited for massive gains. Think of it like an old ATM that takes 2 seconds to update your balance after a withdrawal. If you could press withdraw $100 twice in less than 2 seconds, the machine might give you $200 before realizing you only had $100 to begin with. That's essentially what a race condition is. Zhong exploited this vulnerability methodically over the next few days, creating approximately 9 fraudulent Silk Road vendor accounts and funding each one with an initial deposit of between 200 and 2,000 Bitcoin before initiating multiple withdrawals in rapid succession, sometimes 50 or more before the system could catch up, with some examples showing deposits followed by 5 withdrawals executed in under 5 seconds. In total, he executed over 140 fraudulent transactions across his 9 fake accounts over just a few days. And when the activity stopped, approximately 50,000 Bitcoin had been unlawfully obtained from Silk Road's payment system, which at September 2012 prices amounted to roughly $620,000. 9 years earlier, Jimmy had clicked his mouse 140 times in a basement somewhere in Georgia, probably with hands shaking and heart racing, as he watched Bitcoin flood into addresses he controlled. Each click echoed through the blockchain, recorded permanently in a public ledger that would wait patiently for nearly a decade. Some say greed drove him in those moments, others think it was curiosity, or the thrill of finding a vulnerability and exploiting it. But maybe it was something simpler. Maybe it was just a lonely 22-year-old trying to prove he was smart enough to matter, trying to accumulate proof of worth in the only language he understood. Within hours, Zhong moved quickly to conceal the Bitcoin, consolidating the funds into addresses under his control, and then moving them through cryptocurrency mixing services and multiple wallets, creating layers of transactions designed to obscure their origin. For someone so young, it showed surprising sophistication in understanding how blockchain analysis worked and how to evade it. And then Zhong disappeared from Silk Road's radar completely, with the fake vendor accounts going dormant and the Bitcoin sitting in addresses that to outside observers looked like any other Bitcoin addresses on the blockchain, anonymous and untraceable and seemingly safe. The blockchain never forgets, but Jimmy was about to spend the next decade trying to forget what he'd done. For most people, suddenly acquiring $620,000 would be life-changing. But Jimmy Zhong wasn't most people, and the money he had stolen wasn't just sitting there growing slowly, it was exploding in value at an incomprehensible rate. September 2012 saw Jimmy steal 50,000 Bitcoin worth $620,000, but by December 2013, Bitcoin hit $1,000 per coin, and his holdings were suddenly worth $50 million. December 2017 brought Bitcoin to $20,000 per coin, and his holdings hit $1 billion. By November 2021, Bitcoin reached $66,000 per coin, and his holdings were worth $3.36 billion, making him one of the youngest billionaires in the world on paper, while he hid in a lake house in Georgia. But there was a problem that made all that wealth almost meaningless. He couldn't tell anyone where the money came from without exposing himself to investigation. He couldn't explain his sudden wealth without raising suspicion. He couldn't spend it freely without potentially connecting his real identity to those blockchain addresses that had been sitting dormant since 2012. Every Bitcoin price notification must have been both thrilling and terrifying. Watching his wealth multiply while unable to fully access it, explain it, or celebrate it. He had everything and nothing at the same time. Jimmy created a cover story, telling acquaintances he had been one of Bitcoin's earliest adopters and had acquired thousands of coins in the early days when they were practically worthless. This was actually plausible, given that many early Bitcoin participants had become legitimately wealthy through patient holding. But here's where the story takes a tragic turn. Jimmy once converted some Bitcoin into $700,000 in cash and filled a metal briefcase like in the movies. This illustrated his difficulty interpreting social relationships, as if the briefcase and the visual performance of wealth would somehow create genuine connection with people who would finally see him as someone who mattered. He was performing a role he'd seen on screen, thinking the props would make the story real. He didn't understand that real friendships don't require proof of wealth, and that genuine connection can't be purchased with theatrical displays. He wasn't chasing wealth, he was chasing proof that he mattered to someone. Anyone. Jimmy struggled to recognize authentic social connections throughout this period, spending substantial sums on social activities, believing this would create genuine relationships. Picking up tabs at nightclubs, buying expensive gifts for people who barely knew him, paying for bottle service, thinking money could create the friendship and acceptance he'd been seeking his entire life. In the period before law enforcement's search, Zhang spent approximately $16 million on real estate investments, luxury products, travel, hotels, nightclubs, and other expenses. That sounds like a lot, until you realize it was less than 0.5% of his total wealth. He spent millions trying to buy belonging, while billions sat unused and unusable, trapped wealth that couldn't bring him the one thing he actually wanted: to be seen and valued and connected to other human beings. All the while, Zhang kept most of his Bitcoin in physical storage devices, hidden throughout his homes, rather than trusting online exchanges, which was actually a smart security move, given how many exchanges have been hacked or shut down over the years. One device was hidden in an underground floor safe at his Gainesville lake house, sophisticated and secure with biometric locks. Another was stored on a single-board computer concealed inside a Cheetos popcorn tin in a closet. Simultaneously genius and absurd, since who would think to look inside a junk food container for billions of dollars in cryptocurrency? He had mastered code, understood blockchain security, and successfully hidden one of the largest Bitcoin caches in history. But he never learned how to connect with another human being without props, performances, or money changing hands. In the end, it wasn't the blockchain that would betray him. It was loneliness and the desperate human need to be seen, even when being seen meant risking everything he'd hidden for nearly a decade.
For nearly 10 years, Zhong avoided detection through careful security and sophisticated concealment. 10 years of perfect hiding. 10 years of the secret growing heavier with every passing Bitcoin price increase. And then, in September 2019, Zhong made a critical error that would eventually cost him everything. He transferred a small amount of Bitcoin to a cryptocurrency exchange that followed strict Know Your Customer regulations, the rules that require exchanges to verify users' real identities before allowing them to trade. When Zhong created his account on this exchange, he provided his real name and address. He probably thought a small transaction wouldn't matter after all these years of careful concealment. That single transaction, probably worth just a few $1,000s, would eventually unravel a $3.36 billion secret by creating a direct link between anonymous blockchain addresses and his legal identity. Understanding how this happened requires understanding how blockchain forensics actually works. Companies like Chainalysis use sophisticated software to analyze the public blockchain, the permanent, transparent ledger of all Bitcoin transactions that anyone can view with the right tools. While Bitcoin addresses are pseudonymous, just strings of numbers and letters without names attached, they're not truly anonymous because every transaction is recorded forever, and patterns can be traced across years of activity. Blockchain analysis firms track these patterns across the entire Bitcoin economy, identifying exchanges, mixing services, and known criminal addresses. They build maps of how money flows through the system, waiting for someone to make a mistake and connect an anonymous address to a real identity. When Zhong's Bitcoin moved from addresses connected to the 2012 Silk Road incident to an exchange account bearing his real name, he created what investigators call a choke point, a place where anonymous funds meet identity and the mask finally comes off. The exchange's compliance team flagged the transaction and reported it to federal authorities. When IRS criminal investigation agents analyzed the blockchain data, they identified a connection to James Zhong living in Athens, Georgia. But having a name wasn't enough to build a case that would stand up in federal court. Investigators needed proof. They needed to locate the Bitcoin physically in the form of hardware devices containing the private keys. They needed to connect Jimmy not just to addresses on a blockchain, but to actual storage devices he controlled. And that's when IRSCI Special Agent Trevor McAleenan found something interesting in a completely different database. In March 2019, James Zhong had filed a police report with Athens Clarke County about a burglary at his home, where someone had allegedly broken in and stolen cryptocurrency worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The bitter irony must have been obvious to investigators once they made the connection. Jimmy had called the police on a thief without knowing he'd marked himself for investigation in a completely different case, involving a much larger theft that he himself had committed. The burglar, whoever they were, had vanished with hundreds of thousands in cryptocurrency, but had inadvertently triggered the investigation that would eventually seize billions. Who was the burglar, and how did they know what to look for? Were they someone from his social circle? Were they a Bitcoin community member who did their own blockchain analysis? Were they just random criminals who got incredibly lucky? The police report doesn't say, and investigators have never publicly identified them, leaving that matter completely unresolved. Someone out there knows they broke into a secret billionaire's house and walked away with hundreds of thousands while leaving billions on the table, hidden in places they never found. In calling the police for help, Jimmy gave investigators a reason to visit his home and see his life and start building a profile and develop probable cause for a search warrant.
IRSCI Special Agent Trevor McAleenan was following a digital trail through blockchain analysis when he found the burglary report that would crack the case wide open. He'd been analyzing blockchain data connected to the 2012 Silk Road theft when James Zhong's name appeared, and that same name also appeared in Athens Clarke County Police Department case files from the March 2019 burglary report. McAleenan contacted Detective Jody Thompson, who had originally responded to Jimmy's theft report. Thompson recalled the case because cryptocurrency theft wasn't common in Athens, where burglaries usually involved laptops and textbooks. Detective Thompson and Agent McAleenan teamed up with Sean Magruder, the CEO of BlockTrace, a cyber intelligence firm that contracts with the IRS, forming an investigative team that combined local jurisdiction and federal authority and private sector blockchain forensics expertise. They developed a strategy that was brilliant in its psychological manipulation. They would pretend to be investigating the theft from Jimmy's home when they were actually investigating Jimmy himself for a crime whose proceeds were now worth billions, positioning themselves as helpers trying to solve his burglary case while actually observing him and gathering evidence for a federal search warrant. By positioning themselves as people on his side, investigators could observe Zhong in his environment and see where he kept things and understand his security measures and gauge his reactions. In November 2021, the investigators arrived at Jimmy's lakefront home in Gainesville, Georgia, a nice property on Lake Lanier that suggested wealth but not ostentatious billionaire wealth. Jimmy cooperated with what he believed was an investigation into the theft from his home, letting them in and showing them around and answering their questions,
without realizing he was actually the target of their investigation. Every detail was building toward a warrant. A federal magistrate judge reviewed all the evidence, the blockchain analysis showing connections to the stolen funds, the KYC exchange transfer linking anonymous addresses to his real identity, the burglary report mentioning cryptocurrency, the home visit observations, and signed the warrant. On the morning of November 9, 2021, a convoy of federal vehicles assembled outside Jimmy's lake house in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying federal agents and IRS investigators and local police and forensic specialists and blockchain analysts, along with equipment for analyzing electronic devices and evidence bags for securing hardware, and probably a locksmith for that underground safe they'd heard about. The house was quiet. The lights were off. Jimmy Zhong was likely still asleep inside, completely unaware that this was the last morning of his decade-long secret. The agents moved in fast and professional. The November 9, 2021 search was methodical, with agents searching for electronic storage devices that might contain cryptocurrency. The basement was cold and dark when Agent McAleenan's flashlight swept across the concrete walls and landed on something embedded in the floor, the underground safe with its biometric lock and reinforced steel. Sparks flew, the drill bit into steel. 10 years of silence were about to end. It took specialists 20 minutes to breach it. When the door finally swung open, the air changed, and so did Jimmy Zhong's life, forever. They saw exactly what they'd come for sitting there waiting to be discovered after nearly a decade of perfect concealment. Stacks of $100 bills rubber-banded and meat. They counted it later, finding exactly $661,900 in cash. Gold bars and silver coins glinted under the flashlight beam, and then there were 25 brass coins stamped with a holographic bee, Cassius coins, these physical bitcoins created between 2011 and 2013 that contained actual Bitcoin stored on paper wallets hidden behind tamper-evident holograms. On hardware wallets and storage devices found throughout the home, agents discovered approximately 50,491 Bitcoin, devices that looked like ordinary USB drives but contained more wealth than most Fortune 500 companies possess in liquid assets. But they weren't done yet. When they opened a closet upstairs, investigators found something remarkable: a single-board computer concealed in a popcorn tin, loaded with additional Bitcoin connected to the 2012 Silk Road incident, sitting on a shelf probably right next to actual trash and forgotten belongings. IRSCI Special Agent Trevor McAleenan later said in press interviews that really late at night they were able to say they were successful and that they'd found the evidence they were looking for. In total, the November 9, 2021 search resulted in the seizure of approximately 50,676.1785 Bitcoin, and at the time, with Bitcoin trading at approximately $66,000 per coin, the seizure was valued at roughly $3.36 billion, the largest cryptocurrency seizure in U.S. Department of Justice history at that time.
On November 4, 2022, nearly a year after the seizure, James Zhong stood in United States District Court for the Southern District of New York and pleaded guilty to one count of wire fraud, facing a maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. The courtroom was silent when it came time for Zhong to speak. "I always knew what I did was wrong," he told the judge, and then added, "I think I buried my head in the sand. It made me feel important and worth something." Not greed, not the money itself, but the feeling of importance and worth that the Bitcoin represented to someone who'd spent his entire life feeling invisible. During sentencing, Zhong expressed concern about his dog Chad, his elderly companion, asking what would happen to him while he was in prison. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams released a statement. James Zhong committed wire fraud over a decade ago when he unlawfully obtained approximately 50,000 Bitcoin from Silk Road. For almost 10 years, the whereabouts of this massive chunk of missing Bitcoin had ballooned into an over $3.3 billion mystery. This case shows that we won't stop following the money, no matter how expertly hidden, even to a circuit board in the bottom of a popcorn tin. On April 14, 2023, the court handed down its sentence: 1 year and 1 day in a minimum security federal prison camp. 1 year for $3.36 billion.
For context, Ross Ulbricht had received 2 life sentences plus 40 years for creating Silk Road before being pardoned on January 21, 2025 by President Trump, walking free after serving more than 11 years. Ross got life for creating a marketplace. Jimmy got 1 year for stealing from it. Zhong agreed to forfeit everything: his stake in R&D investments, the seized Bitcoin, cash, precious metals, and Casassius coins. He completed his sentence in 2024 after serving approximately 10.5 months, walking out at age 34 with no fortune, no real estate, no Bitcoin, and a federal conviction on his record. The case became a reference point about the myth of Bitcoin anonymity, the idea that blockchain transactions were truly untraceable, when in reality they were just pseudonymous, permanent records waiting for someone to connect addresses to identities. 9 years earlier, Jimmy had clicked his mouse 140 times, and each click echoed through the blockchain, recorded permanently until IRS CI Special Agent Trevor McAleenan finally followed the trail back to a lake house in Georgia where billions sat hidden in a Cheetos tin and an underground safe. James Zhong today maintains an extremely low public profile, with no social media presence or public statements. He's 34 years old now, starting over with nothing but his story and his conviction. Nobody knows where he is or whether he's found any measure of peace after a decade of paranoia and isolation. Jimmy has disappeared from public view entirely, perhaps understanding finally that true invisibility isn't about hiding wealth, but about living quietly without the weight of secrets.